art thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life.
Hey everybody, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I am Mike.
And today we're going to finish up the book of Titus. We're going to do all 15 verses of the last chapter, chapter 3, and we should be able to get through with it in about the regular amount of time. So, Mike, where should we start?
Well, let's just jump right into verse 1 here, since we're going to be doing 15 verses here instead of 10. Titus chapter 3, verse 1. Remember then to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work. So Paul here continues and expands on the ideas and themes he developed and touched on in chapter 2. We are to be submissive to rulers and authorities. For reasons we may not always comprehend, God does put rulers over us that sometimes we may not agree with. Now, this had particular import to the unstable nature of the Cretans. As you may recall from our earlier studies in Titus, the Cretans were known as a byword for lazy, uncouth, and gluttonous behavior. So submitting fully to Roman rule was something that was likely hard to do for the Cretans outside of grace. This also brings up a really interesting topic, and that is the limits and roles of government and how a Christian should relate to them. As I mentioned earlier, God sometimes does put rulers that are not what we would like, and to be honest, may in fact be pretty nasty in some cases. Yet the Bible is clear that God knows these things, and for the most part, even as he picks the delusions of those who are in rebellion to him, he picks rulers to rule over us, be they good or bad. Yet at the other extreme, God does not want us to submit to evil and iniquity. If a ruler proclaims, "Worship me as God," we are not to submit to that. So there exists this tension between the two. The question then is, where does civil disobedience fall for Christians? And I'll just give one or two quick examples here. In Exodus, we learn that when the Israelites were multiplying in Egypt, Pharaoh became afraid of their growing power. So he commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill every newborn baby boy. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them, and they let the boys live. We're also, of course, familiar with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who chose to be thrown into the fiery furnace rather than worship a golden image that their king commanded them to worship. And as a final example, many of the early Christians disobeying and not worshiping Caesar as God, as Lord, meant death. And yet they refused because they knew that if they were to do this, they would be giving Caesar what was due to Jesus alone. In many instances, they were paid for their disobedience with their lives. So we see this tension here, and I leave it up to you, the listener, to sort of work that out for yourselves. Chris?
Man, that was some really insightful commentary. That was really good. One thing I know that wasn't like the easiest commentary in the world. I know that we're, not always like the submit to the government type, but it's certainly true. And I think sometimes we get the rulers that we deserve. The biblical, I think sometimes we get the ruler that sort of reflects us, kind of like Saul. And a good example to add to one that you mentioned there is Saul's son, Jonathan, who disobeyed his father's command. So he was disobeying his father and the king when he helped David, because the order was to kill David, essentially. So that's an interesting example.
One that comes to mind that might be slightly controversial are people, ministers of the gospel who practice civil disobedience towards things like abortion clinics or other things like that, and end up going to jail or being sued over the whole thing for punitive damages. I'm of the opinion that there are cases where we as Christians are supposed to do that. It's a tough call to make. God wants us to do justice and righteousness. He wants us to uphold the causes of the weak and those who need mercy. Those are the brokenhearted.
Well, sure. This is no. In fact, I think that it's interesting that this verse ends essentially saying, "Don't be passive," because it has the, people might say, well, it's just sort of pacifism here, but really the last part of verse 1 here says, "To be ready to do every good work." To be ready to do every good work is almost like being active in finding those good works to do, and certainly those good works can be like helping out the poor and needy orphans and widows, but also things that would sort of, like you're saying, I don't know exactly, I can't think of a great example right now, but yeah. And I think this last part about be ready to do every work has an idea of seizing the day in terms of those opportunities that present themselves. Like when you see the homeless person on the street or whatever. I know I recently was convicted that I saw like this homeless person. I felt like I should give him money, but then I was like in my head, I was like, well, I just can't like go giving money to every homeless person I see. That would just be crazy. But then I was thinking, how many homeless people do I see every day? I mean, it's not like I see a million of them. And so what if I gave, and not asking questions or not asking anything of them, but just, sometimes the Lord doesn't prompt me, but if he does, I think I should make something of it. But anyway, sort of getting off track there. The first part about this, I agree with you that he says, put them in mind to be subject to the principalities and powers and to obey magistrates. The remind them in the grammar of the Greek there is a present tense, sort of a go on reminding. So I think that I agree with you that Titus was probably, having trouble with this issue with the Cretans. And so, yeah, I guess that's it for that verse.
All right. Verse 2. To speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Now, this is another good piece of advice to look at. To speak evil of no one. It appears that what we would consider here not only slander, but also insulting and abusive language is in view here by Paul. Control the tongue. I know, unfortunately, from personal experience. Yet when we do, we notice our whole mindset changing. Another piece of advice here from Paul is to be gentle. Now, this is something that I think many Christians, including myself, could really work on. Sometimes it's so hard to be gentle, especially when you're amped up about, well, anything. But you know what? Most of the time, the lack of gentleness is a learned response to things that make us angry or unhappy. And we are just used to responding a certain way, and that's kind of what comes out. If we learn to understand that and not get upset when others do wrong to us, or not get upset when others around us are upset, we will be a long way to being more Christ-like in our interactions, in our situations. And our great example of that, of course, is Jesus, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in turn, which is what that's out of 1 Peter chapter 2. And then, of course, there's bless those who persecute you, wrote Paul in Romans, and bless and do not curse. People may be insulting and abusive in their language to us, but by God's grace, our language to them should be altogether different. Chris?
That's really good, too, some really good examples. The King James here says, to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers, but gentle, showing all meekness. So basically, just don't be a jerk. Christians shouldn't be jerks. That sums that one up. But it describes that a little bit more clear in Ephesians 4, verse 31, where it says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Barclay has in a section, he titles this section of Titus, the good citizen, and he goes through all the different verses here talking about how it relates to being a good citizen, which he says the Christian that Paul has in mind here. He says, a good citizen is careful in speech. He must slander no one. No man should say about other people what he would not like them to say about him. The good citizen will be as careful of the words he speaks as of the deeds he does. A good citizen is tolerant. He is not aggressive. The Greek word is amachos, which means not a fighter. This does not mean that the good citizen will not stand up for principles which he believes to be right, but that he will never be so opinionated as to believe that no other way than his own is right. He will allow to others the same right to have their convictions as he claims for himself to have his own. That's William Barclay, excellent commentator on Titus, by the way. And then finally, John Calvin says, speaking of this last phrase in this verse, which is unto all men, actually to no man, it depends on which version you're reading. It says, he says towards all men in order to intimate that he should bear with even the lowest and meanest persons. Believers holding wicked men in contempt did not think them worthy of any forbearance. Such severity, which arises from nothing else than pride, Paul wished to correct. That's an interesting thought, that it arises from pride, this idea of contempt. So anyway, that's all I have for that one.
Okay, good. Titus chapter 3, verse 3. For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another. It's interesting to see how Paul backs up his imperatives here to be loving and good to all. He doesn't just hearken back to Old Testament passages and say, well, here's what's important to God, so go do them. No, he instead appeals to the idea that we were once all messed up. We were backwards and totally out of our mind. He tells us here in this verse that we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, that we were hated by others and hating one another. Paul is appealing to all the memories of how we once lived and once were, and then is going on to talk about how much Jesus changed us. You'll see that here later on. He is talking about the very grace we get from the Lord, the thing that changes us more than anything else. It's all about grace. Chris?
Very good. I think this is great, too. He says that's the reason why we are to be gentle towards all men. It's not easy to be nice to even the worst of all men, as Calvin points out. But one of the reasons that we can do that is because we recognize that we were once in that way. As it says here, for we ourselves were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving diverse lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. Really describes the unrepentant heart of the unconverted. They're in bondage to sin. And really, the only fix for that heart is Christ. It's sort of a microcosm of what I feel the world needs, the gospel, more than it does any other anything else. I mean, that's how you change the world, one converted heart at a time, because there's no chance for us to be good in the state that we are. And of course, that I believe one of the words here, deceived, is part of this. Disobedient, deceived, serving diverse lusts and pleasures, and that sums up even the most wicked person. I think is deserving of compassion because they are at some level deceived. Even the most vile, blood-drinking Satanist out there is still, on some level or another, totally deceived, because no one, if they really knew Christ and who he was, that would rebel. I don't think, but maybe they would. But anyway, that's all I have for that.
On the ideas and themes he developed and touched on in chapter 2. We are to be submissive to rulers and authorities. For reasons we may not always comprehend, God does put rulers over us that sometimes we may not agree with. Now, this had particular import to the unstable nature of the Cretans. As you may recall from our earlier studies in Titus, the Cretans were known as a byword for lazy, uncouth, and gluttonous behavior. So submitting fully to Roman rule was something that was likely hard to do for the Cretans outside of grace. This also brings up a really interesting topic, and that is the limits and roles of government and how a Christian should relate to them. As I mentioned earlier, God sometimes does put rulers that are not what we would like, and to be honest, may in fact be pretty nasty in some cases.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. what be all else to me, save that thou art, thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life.
Hey everybody, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I am Mike.
And today we're going to finish up the book of Titus. We're going to do all 15 verses of the last chapter, chapter 3, and we should be able to get through with it in about the regular amount of time. So, Mike, where should we start?
Well, let's just jump right into verse 1 here, since we're going to be doing 15 verses here instead of 10. Titus chapter 3, verse 1. Remember then to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work. So Paul here continues and expands